Good evening, and welcome once again to the Darwin College Lecture Series on Song, our fifth lecture. Seeing this piano on the stage, I'm sure has made some of you think you're probably in the wrong venue and anticipating a concert rather than a lecture. You're mistaken, of course, because I'm delighted to say that today's lecture is in fact a lecture recital, a double act by our speaker and singer, Carola Darwin, and pianist, Maria Noel Kendall. Dr. Darwin took her first degree in natural sciences and chemistry here at Cambridge and then went on to gain a master's in singing at the Royal Northern College of Music and a PhD at Sheffield University. She's both a musicologist and a trained opera singer, and she combines a career of research and teaching at the Royal School of Music in London with giving live performances across the world. In fact, her first performance, I'm told, was as chief field mouse in a musical version of Wind in the Willows, and that's when she was 5. Her research into the Viennese composer Johann Müller-Hermann was part of the BBC Radio 3's series Forgotten Women Composers project and was the basis for a recent Composer of the Week on Müller-Hermann, for which Carola was also interviewed. She is widely published and in fact has a book in the making at the moment, The Other Voice, Women Musicians in Alma Mahler's Vienna, to be published, she's promised, by the end of this year, or it's written by the end of this year. As her name suggests, of course, Carola has a special connection to Darwin College. She is the great-great-granddaughter of Charles Darwin, and I think I'm right in saying the first family member to deliver a Darwin College lecture. So we're very delighted by that. Maria Noel Kendall began her piano studies in London and as a teenager was a finalist in the BBC Young Musician of the Year competition. After leaving Cambridge University, she studied at the Liszt Academy in Budapest and since has established her career as a musician, pianist of course, both teaching and performing at home and internationally. Carola and Maria Knowles are soon to release a CD of songs by Viennese composers, about whom we will shortly be hearing, of course. So please join me with a very warm welcome onto the stage, both our speakers, performers tonight for Hearing Her Voice, Women Musicians in Vienna, 1900. Please.
Good afternoon. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm so grateful to Darwin College for including me in this very special lecture series and giving me the chance to talk about song in the context of my research. Let's start with a song.
Drückt
Before we go any further, I'd like to thank my friend and colleague Marie-Noëlle Kendall for playing for us today. It's such a pleasure to work with her. The song that you've just heard was composed around 1882 by Mathilde Kralik, a female composer who lived in Vienna at the turn of the 20th century. If you've never heard of her, then you are not alone. Until recently, the history of music focused on a relatively small number of great men. Composers treated as heroes not only because of the quality of the music they wrote, but often also because they were seen as innovators who had in some way moved music forward. The history of music in Vienna at this period is no exception. Accounts of it tend to start from towering figures like Johannes Brahms, Gustav Mahler, and Arnold Schoenberg, whose works have been performed and analysed over and over again. Today, though, I want to look at music in Vienna in a different way. First of all, I'm going to put women at the centre of the picture, not because the great men aren't still worth discussing, but because there is so much about music that's exciting to discover, which we miss if we leave women's creativity out of our histories. Secondly, rather than focusing only on the music, I'll sketch a little of the political, social, and artistic context around my characters. I hope this will help to explain the challenges and opportunities that they experienced and where these were different from those of their male colleagues. Finally, I want to give you a sense of the exceptionally collaborative and interlinked way that music is created. The world of music creates and requires a complex symbiosis between composers, performers, entrepreneurs, institutions like concert halls and conservatoires, teachers, critics, and audiences. These different roles are linked together into an elaborate and interdependent ecosystem. Vienna around 1900 is a particularly good place to demonstrate this, as a comparatively small town with a huge appetite for the arts. It's a place where the musical ecosystem intersected in myriad ways with literature and visual art, as well as philosophy, psychology, and social politics. Today, I'll try to give you a taste of these fascinating and complicated networks by showing some diagrams of how the characters in the story are linked together. My talk has at its centre 4 women musicians and their lives and works. They are, in age order, Mathilde Kralik, born 1857, Johanna Müller-Hermann, born 1868, Maria Gutald-Schroeder, born 1874, and Elsa Bienenfeld, born 1877. To give you a sense of how they worked within and contributed to the Viennese musical ecosystem, I'll divide this talk into 4 time periods. Ringstrasse, 1867 to 1897, Opera House and Town Hall, 1897 to 1914, War and Reconstruction, 1914 to 1938, and finally, Anschluss, Oblivion, and Recovery, 1938 to the present. 1867, the year before Johanna Müller-Hermann was born, was a critical year for Vienna, which for hundreds of years had been the seat of the Habsburg emperors. They ruled over a vast swathe of the middle of Europe, including not only what are now Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but also parts of Poland and Ukraine and even Italy. During the 19th century, agitation for recognition and independence of different national groups in the different parts of the empire became increasingly widespread and vociferous. In 1867, in response to a crushing military defeat by Prussia, the Emperor Franz Joseph II decided to deal with the problem by dividing his empire in 2. The western half was to be ruled by him as the Emperor of Austria, while the eastern half would be ruled also by him, but this time as the King of Hungary. The idea was to acknowledge the historical claims of the Hungarians to a separate state while maintaining his personal authority over Austria-Hungary. At the same time, he granted a number of liberal reforms, including guaranteeing equality before the law for all the empire's ethnic groups, as well as freedom of expression, religion, and assembly. He later also instituted state-funded education at primary level throughout the empire. Although these measures did very little to quieten the demands of the many national groups in the empire who still craved autonomy, in Vienna the following decades were generally a time of prosperity and confidence. The city walls which bounded the old town had been demolished in 1857, and in its place a wide boulevard, the Ringstrasse, was built to encircle Old Vienna, now the first district. A series of grand buildings were erected around the Ringstrasse, a town hall, law courts, a new opera house, a theatre, and museums of art and natural history. Meanwhile, industrialization and the spread of the railway across the empire created new business opportunities, and many Viennese became extremely rich. Born in 1868, Johanna Müller-Hermann was in some ways a typical product of these prosperous and hopeful times. Her father was a civil servant in the Ministry of Education. Her mother was born into the minor nobility. The family lived in the first district, not far from the Ringstrasse. Her parents were keen amateur musicians, as was very common in middle-class Viennese households. And young Johanna and her brother and sister grew up hearing music making from a very young age. Her brother Albert, 2 years older than her, even started a family music society, which gave regular concerts. Years later, Johanna Müller-Hermann described it like this: "We were allowed to turn the salon into a concert hall and invite all our friends. There were even printed programs. We also put on theatrical performances, with the audience consisting mostly of our parents in the stalls and our cook Marie in the side seats. The chambermaid was urgently needed in the wings." In 1870, the Karlik family moved to Vienna from Linz. Matilda's father ran a very successful glass-making business in Bohemia, now the Czech Republic. By his second marriage, he had 5 children. And when it was time for Matilda's brother, Richard, to go to the University of Vienna, the whole family moved to the capital. At the time, there was very little provision for secondary education for girls. Richard had attended a gymnasium, an academic secondary school which prepared boys for university, but these were not open to girls. Instead, Matilda was tutored at home. Matilda Karlik's father was a largely self-taught amateur violinist who was a passionate player of string quartets, and her mother was a fine amateur pianist. The children were all given music lessons, and Matilda was introduced to composition by her brother Richard, who was 5 years older. The siblings played chamber music with their parents and regularly attended concerts and the opera. You'll notice, as I discuss the lives of my chosen musicians, that they all came from relatively privileged backgrounds. Although this was certainly not essential to a career as a musician at this period, any more than it is now, the importance of early training meant that successful musicians very often had parents who were knowledgeable and enthusiastic about music, or wealthy, or both. When Matilda Karlik was 17, she started taking piano lessons with Julius Epstein, a well-known piano professor at the Vienna Conservatoire, who also taught Gustav Mahler. Epstein was impressed by Karlik's compositions and suggested that she should study with the composer Anton Bruckner. After a year of private lessons, Karlik was advanced enough to join the second-year composition class at the Conservatoire, the same class as Mahler. Mahler is an example of a musician from a relatively impoverished background. He struggled to pay his way through the Conservatoire despite gaining a scholarship and earned a bare living as a piano teacher. He and Karlik were both awarded prizes for composition at the end of their time at the Conservatoire. Karlik was given first prize for composition and a silver medal for a movement of a suite, which she conducted herself. Mahler won second prize. During her time at the Conservatoire, Mathilda's father was raised to the nobility, taking the name Karlik von Meerswalden. This is why you may sometimes see the composer's name as Mathilda Karlik von Meerswalden. Her father died not long after, and after leaving the Conservatoire, Karlik continued to live at home with her now widowed mother. Johanna Müller-Hermann came to composing in a rather different way. You may remember that among the reforms that the Emperor Franz Joseph implemented, there was a huge increase in free primary education across the empire. One of the architects of this new venture was Johanna Müller-Hermann's father, whose position in the Ministry of Education included responsibility for a new college that would train girls as primary school teachers to serve in the new free schools. Given the paucity of other opportunities for secondary education for girls in Vienna, it's perhaps not surprising that Johanna and her younger sister Tona were sent to study at this teacher training college, the Imperial and Royal State Educational Institute for Women Teachers, in Hegelgasse in the 1st District. Interestingly, however, their father also said that he wanted his daughters to be financially independent in later life, which turned out to be the case, though not necessarily in the way that he had imagined. The importance of education for girls was one of a number of issues that motivated the Viennese women's movement at the end of the 19th century. Early initiatives included classes in sewing, cookery, hairdressing, and so on, as a way to help women support themselves. But by the 1880s, there was an increasingly clear call for full secondary education for girls, along the lines of the gymnasium, which prepared boys for university. Our third musician, Else Bienenfeld, was 9 years younger than Johanna Müller-Hermann. By the time she was old enough to need a secondary education, the girls' teacher training college in Hegelgasse had become a girls' gymnasium. Else and her sister Bianca attended it, and were some of the first women to be able not only to pass the school leaving exam, the Matura, but to attend the University of Vienna on the strength of it. Else Bienenfeld also studied the violin at the Vienna Conservatoire from the age of 8. Unlike Johanna Müller-Hermann and Mathilda Karlik, the Bienenfelds were Jewish. They lived a little further from the centre of Vienna in the 2nd District. Else's father, Heinrich, was a talented lawyer who lived beyond his means, and after trying and failing to repair the family fortunes by speculating on the stock market, tragically he took his own life when Elsa was 18. Elsa started by studying science at university, but changed her mind after hearing Guido Adler lecture. Adler was the professor of history and theory of music at Vienna University and seems to have been a generous mentor as well as an inspiring teacher. A passionate supporter of women's rights, he allowed Müller-Hermann into his class as an auditor when women were not yet admitted as full students to the university. After leaving the teacher training college in Hegelgasse, Müller-Hermann had worked as a primary school teacher for 3 years. But in 1893, she married Dr. Otto Müller, a civil servant like her father. This meant giving up her job, as married women weren't allowed to work in schools. She took the opportunity that this gave her to study music seriously, joining Adler's class at the university and also studying privately. Here's a diagram that shows some of the relationships that linked my musicians to the musical culture of the time. I've only shown people and places that I've mentioned in this talk so far. The pink points are women, the blue are men, and the green points are institutions. Like Müller-Hermann, Mathilda Karlik had an older brother who shared her interest in music. However, Richard Karlik chose to develop a career as a writer. Karlik's compositions include more than 200 songs, many of which are settings of Richard's poetry, as well as oratorios and an opera, also with text by her brother. The song cycle Maya, which the songs I'm singing today are from, is one of their collaborations, settings of poetry that Richard Kralik wrote in response to his engagement and marriage to Maya Flattich in 1883. The poetry is direct and simple, almost simplistic, but it uses fresh, vivid imagery, which is rarely cliched. Matilda Kralik's setting is also simple, without vocal flourishes. The piano plays an important role. It's worth remembering that Matilda Kralik was a very good pianist indeed. In Ein Neuer Frühling, which we'll perform next, you'll hear how the piano's rapid triplets recall both the rushing waters of springtime and also the sense of excitement and awakening that the poem expresses. In 1897, two important events occurred in the great municipal buildings on the Ringstrasse. On the west side, Karl Lueger, the new mayor, was installed in the town hall. I'll discuss him a little later. Further round on the southwest side, the new director of the Vienna Opera, Gustav Mahler, took up his position. He soon developed a reputation for a passionate commitment to both the music and the drama of the opera, and a hatred of Schlamperei, a wonderful word meaning carelessness or slovenliness. One of the singers that Mahler recruited was our fourth and final musician, the soprano Maria Guthalsschroeder, who arrived in Vienna in 1900. Guthalsschroeder was born in 1874 in Weimar in Germany and made her debut at the Opera House there. She was playing a small role, Lola in Cavalleria Rusticana, when she was spotted by an impresario who pointed her out to Mahler. He recruited her for the Vienna Opera, where she was one of the principal singers for more than 25 years. It's much harder to reconstruct the creativity and artistry of a historical performer than it is to understand what made a composer or a writer special. There are very few early recordings of Maria Guthalsschroeder, but they aren't very high quality. And in any case, it wasn't the quality of her voice that Guthalsschroeder was famous for. Contemporary reviews described it as brittle, sometimes even harsh. But she was an exceptional musician, and her approach to acting was, for the time, quite out of the ordinary. What fascinated her was to get inside the character, developing through the rehearsal process her sense of how the character moved and how to express the character's different emotions in a range of vocal timbres. Until, she said, the different parts become a whole character, a real person on the stage, She lures us into every cranny of her soul, into every phase of her feelings. She arouses us with the human tragedy as it breaks out and gives us the likeness of a true life of her time. Contemporary writers particularly singled out Gustav Schroeder's performance as Susanna in The Marriage of Figaro, and also her Carmen, where she gave the character a gritty realism that amazed her audiences. In his book on the Vienna opera, Max Graf described her Carmen as something from the street, from the gutter, hard, brutal, and made gripping by 100 ingenious details of acting. Gustav Schroeder's performances weren't always praised, however. Mahler gave her a huge range of roles, not all of which suited her, and the reaction of the press was also coloured by a suspicion of Mahler himself. Mahler's reforming zeal made him enemies among those who were comfortable with the old ways, and as a Jew from Bohemia, he also attracted anti-Semitism and snobbery. Mahler gradually brought the Viennese round to his style as a conductor, but it took longer for his compositions to gain acceptance. This was a time when composers like Mahler, Zemlinsky, and Schoenberg were pushing at the boundaries of conventional harmony to see how fast harmonies could shift and how much dissonance they could accommodate before the music's harmonic structure broke down. Schoenberg eventually abandoned conventional tonal harmony altogether, but Mahler and Zemlinsky never did. Müller-Hermann's approach to her career as a composer was careful and methodical. After studying privately with a number of well-known teachers, she published some pieces for the instruments she knew most about: piano, violin, and voice. Next, she tried her hand at a string quartet, but realized that she needed help with weaving together 4 equal lines of music into a satisfactory counterpoint. She sought Zemlinsky's help, and when the quartet was finished, she dedicated it to him. Müller-Hermann said later that Zemlinsky's lessons had helped her to find her own style of composition, still with a sense of tonality and key, but with swiftly moving harmonic colours which rarely settle for more than a few bars. After publishing her string quartet, which was very well received by critics, she wrote and published a number of other chamber pieces before once again returning to have composition lessons. This time she chose to study orchestration with the Czech composer Josef Bohuslav Förster, who taught at the New Vienna Conservatoire, and whose wife, Berta Förster-Lauterer, was a soloist at the Vienna Opera. In 1911, Müller-Hermann's piece for women's choir was performed in the same concert as the premiere of Schoenberg's Friede auf Erden. In 1912, she was taken on by the publisher, Universal Edition, who already published Mahler, Zemlinsky, and Schoenberg. Jean Sibelius, Ethel Smythe, and Karl Szymanowski were taken on in the same year. Meanwhile, Matilda Karlik was also building up a solid foundation of publishing and performance. By 1900, she had published music for solo piano and an orchestral overture, as well as unaccompanied choral music and works for choir and orchestra. Her catalogue included many songs and several song cycles. The cycle Maya, which you've heard some excerpts from, was one of them. Although she set poetry by a range of poets, nearly half her songs are settings of her brother Richard's poetry. The importance of their artistic partnership can be seen in a letter to her sister-in-law, Richard's wife, Maya, where Matilda suggests that Gustav Mahler might be interested in setting some of her brother Richard's poetry. Mahler might come to the concert, she wrote, in which case you could start promoting Richard's poetry immediately, although I'd prefer to have the monopoly for as long as possible. In 1910, one of their largest joint works, the opera Blume und Weißblume, was premiered in Hagen in Western Germany. It's described as a Märchenspiel and is based on a folktale. It later became famous as a result of a plagiarism scandal that blew up in the 1930s. An ex-monk named Nicasius Schutter published an opera that copied more than 50 pages of the score of Karlik's opera, note for note. Karlik reacted strongly in the press, but did not take any legal action against the perpetrator. The Viennese press provided Elsa Bienenfeld with her main outlet for creativity. After gaining her degree from the University of Vienna in 1903, she was awarded a doctorate for a dissertation on 16th century vocal music. Her first job was teaching music history at the girls' secondary school founded by Eugenie Schwarzwald. In the autumn of 1904, a series of evening classes were started at the school. Bienenfeld taught music history and was joined by Schoenberg, who taught harmony and counterpoint, and Zemlinsky, who taught orchestration and musical form. These evening classes were the foundation of Schoenberg's enormously influential teaching career, which trained a whole generation of composers, including Alban Berg, Anton Webern, and Wilhelm von Webenau. In 1905, Bienenfeld started work at the Neues Wiener Journal, a successful Viennese newspaper which aimed at a female readership and focused particularly on human interest stories and the arts. She was the paper's music critic for more than 25 years and was the first woman to write under her own name on music for a major Viennese newspaper. Of all her many reviews, however, I can only pick out a few to discuss today. In 1908, Arnold Schoenberg's second string quartet was premiered by the Rose Quartet. Unusually for a string quartet, two of the movements include a soprano part, which was sung by Maria Guthold-Schroeder. Elsa Bienenfeld was at the concert, and her review gives a sense of the strong emotions that this very experimental work aroused in the audience, and of Bienenfeld's response. During the premiere of the most recent Schoenberg quartet, she wrote, there was laughing, stamping, yelling, screaming, and hissing. Here is a work which the composer had worked on for many months, which expresses ideas which are not at all commonplace, which presents problems which required all his skill to solve. How could anyone, however highly trained they are in music, understand it and then judge it immediately and completely, whether positively or negatively, at the first hearing, and without seeing the score? It's impossible. The furious hissing was as incomprehensible as rapturous applause would have been. People are pretty peculiar if they're ready to judge a work before the whole of it has even been played. Biographies of Schoenberg and of Mahler make it clear that although some of the reasons for the suspicion and dislike that their work inspired stemmed from social and artistic conservatism, Viennese society was pervaded by anti-Semitism, which made it commonplace to condemn the work of any artist who happened to be Jewish, as Schoenberg and Mahler both were. Anti-Semitic feeling was also exploited by politicians as a way to gain the popular vote. The prime example of this was Karl Lueger, who became mayor of Vienna in 1897. In his memoir, he describes how he sat through a political meeting listening to a rival expressing anti-Semitic ideas and realized that this was the way to achieve popularity. He duly adopted such an anti-Semitic stance that, ironically, when he won the mayoral election, Emperor Franz Joseph refused for 2 years to appoint him. After finally taking up his place in the town hall, Lueger became an immensely popular and successful mayor. His successes included a program of public works, which brought Vienna into the 20th century. He set up the city's electric trams and extended gas, water, and electricity to thousands of new homes. However, Lueger's popularity and his gift for self-promotion also meant that the anti-Semitic policies of his party, the Christian Socials, became increasingly widespread and influential. He was the Viennese politician that Adolf Hitler most admired. One of the challenges of writing about Vienna from the far side of the Holocaust is to understand how the prejudice and bigotry of Viennese anti-Semitism was not understood at the time for the horror that it is, and that it turned out to be in the hands of Adolf Hitler. While it's important to acknowledge that not every anti-Semitic remark was made by someone who would have supported the murderous policies of the Nazis, the acceptability of anti-Semitism in this society undoubtedly made those policies more possible. The decades leading up to the First World War also saw an increasingly heated debate over the rights and roles of women. Women's organisations which campaigned for women's right to the vote, to education, and access to employment became more organised and popular. By 1914, more than 40,000 women belonged to one. In addition, the question of women's roles and position in society was discussed by writers and philosophers such as Marianne Heinisch and Rosa Mayreder. There was also a strong reaction against the women's movement from those who valued the status quo. The popular satirical writer Karl Kraus was well known for his misogynist aphorisms, while Otto Weininger's book, Sex and Character, set out a pseudo-scientific assessment of the relationship between the male and the female, as follows. The abstract male is the image of God, the absolute something. The female is the symbol of nothing. That is the significance of women in the universe, and in this way, male and female complete and condition one another. This was the world that my four musicians were navigating in 1914, when the assassination of Prince Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, started the First World War. Look at how the network of relationships has become more complicated and interlinked as they have developed their careers. The war was a disaster for Austria-Hungary. As well as the death of over 1 million soldiers and hundreds of thousands of civilians, the Allied naval blockade and the Russian invasion of Galicia, now in Poland, caused severe food shortages, and rationing was introduced in 1915. My four musicians were women in middle age, so they were not expected to fight, and musical life in Vienna did go on. In 1916, Richard Strauss's Ariadne auf Naxos was premiered at the Vienna Opera. To her disgust, Maria Gotthard was replaced in the leading role of the composer by her understudy, Lotte Lehmann. Richard Strauss, who had mentored Gotthard as a young singer, decided that he preferred Lehmann's voice, and there was nothing that Gotthard could do. In her memoirs, Lotte Lehmann comments on the grandeur of the premiere, the last gasp of the aristocratic elegance of pre-war Vienna. Meanwhile, Müller-Hermann was gradually experimenting with larger forces. In 1915, Universal Edition published her works for female voice choir, and in 1916, her first orchestral work, the symphonic poem Heroische Ouverture, was premiered in the Great Hall of the Vienna Musikverein, Vienna's grandest concert venue. The piece was reviewed widely and in general favourably, though Bienenfeld was one of the few reviewers who didn't comment on the surprising fact that the composer was a woman. As the war was ending, one by one, many of the different nationalities in the empire broke away and declared their independence. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia were recognized as separate states, and suddenly Vienna was no longer the seat of an emperor at the center of an empire, but merely the capital of a small, starving republic. Thousands of Czechs, Hungarians, Slovenians, and others left Vienna to return to their new countries, while Jewish refugees continued to stream into the capital as they had done throughout the war, escaping pogroms in Russia and extreme poverty elsewhere. The constitution of the new Austrian Republic gave women the vote for the first time. Vienna's economic situation was dire. Businesses were cut off from their markets in the old empire, and inflation wiped out savings. Thousands of Austrian children were fed by aid organizations like the American Relief Administration. The Karlik family are said to have lost their money to a fraudulent lawyer who absconded to America, taking their millions with him. Richard and Matilda would struggle financially for the rest of their lives. Many younger Viennese left for good, mostly to Germany, but also to America. In May 1919, Karl Lueger's party, the Christian Socials, lost the city's elections to the left-wing Social Democrats, who took over in the town hall. In their 15 years in power, the Social Democrats achieved some remarkable reforms in what was known as Red Vienna. They responded to the lack of housing by building large housing blocks, the Siedlungen, which provided modern flats for thousands of Viennese families. Public health issues like child mortality and venereal disease were tackled by new medical and social initiatives. A number of public baths and swimming pools were built. Unfortunately, the Social Democrats' achievements, such as a 50% reduction in child mortality, didn't prevent many from criticising them. The initiatives were often imposed without consultation with the people they were supposed to help, and as a result was seen by many as both restrictive and ineffectual. And right-wing nationalist and anti-Semitic groups were always ready to make capital out of any failures. Gustav Klimt continued to work at the Vienna Opera, now the Staatsoper, the opera house for the Austrian state, until 1926, but also sang a wide range of roles in other opera houses around Europe. She particularly enjoyed what she described as interesting roles, strong-minded characters such as Carmen, Isolde, Salome, Electra, and Octavian. She later described how important she felt it was to get under the skin of a character like this. "The complexity of a new and interesting character," she wrote, "can't be understood in a moment. Their irrational, perhaps unsympathetic behavior requires a long-term empathy so that the understanding and the imagination can be stimulated more and more." In 1924, Gustav Klimt premiered the part of the woman, that is, the only character, in Schoenberg's Erwartung. The performance was extremely successful, with critics commenting on the power of the music and the moving effect of the performance. After she retired from the Staatsoper as a singer, Gustav Klimt was the director for a number of productions, including one of Purcell's Dido and Aeneas, a little-known rarity at this period, particularly outside Britain. She also coached a number of younger singers in the roles that she had created and developed. She died in 1935. Matilda Karlik's brother, Richard, was one of those who rejected the reforms of Red Vienna and lamented the passing of the old order. Tuesday gatherings in his house celebrated conservative Catholic values, including significant anti-Semitism, and a romantic medievalism that was summed up by the name of the periodical Richard had founded, The Grail. It's not clear how far Matilda Karlik shared these sentiments. She was certainly happy to set Richard's poetry on historical and religious subjects, and she is recorded as sometimes assisting her brother in his salons. But her letters are generally free of the kind of anti-Semitic sentiments that pervade Richard's later writings. In her musical career, Matilda Karlik was very much associated with women's groups. She was a long-standing member of the Club of Viennese Women Musicians, and many of her performances were by women. Perhaps this hampered her career, since, unlike Müller-Hermann, her works were not often performed in major venues. The more political and reforming aspects of these groups seem not to have interested her as far as we know, but through them she would have been exposed to some of the more radical ideas that Richard rejected. Her 70th and 80th birthdays were marked by respectful notices in many newspapers. How far she responded musically to the artistic experimentation that was going on around her at this time, I haven't yet been able to ascertain. There is plenty more work to be done on her beautiful music. Müller-Hermann was given a new opportunity when her teacher, Josef Förster, left Vienna in 1918 to return to the new state of Czechoslovakia. Leaving his position at the new Vienna Conservatoire, he recommended that Müller-Hermann should be appointed in his place. She became the first female teacher of music theory and composition in a conservatoire in the German-speaking world, and was well enough known that a newspaper in America chose to interview her. Her position at the Conservatoire would have been a valuable source of a regular income in financially difficult times. But she also seems to have found teaching congenial. Her training at the Girls' Teacher Training College all those years ago seems to have stood her in good stead. Meanwhile, she continued to write music for both large and small forces. Her first and only symphony was premiered in 1919. The performance was hampered by a last-minute change of conductor, and some reviewers were sceptical whether a woman was actually capable of writing a symphony. Elsa Bienenfeld's reviews were more positive. "Magnificent in sound," she wrote, "this work is a foretaste of the composer's significant ability and of her great ambition." In 1920, another symphonic poem inspired by Ibsen's play Brand was published by Universal Edition. And then in 1930, her largest work, the oratorio Lied der Erinnerung, a setting of Walt Whitman in German translation, was premiered in the Great Hall at the Musikverein. Here's another diagram to show how the network of relationships continued to develop as time went on. Müller-Hermann also wrote 2 sets of orchestral songs, a cello sonata and several works for organ during this period. We'll be performing one of Müller-Hermann's orchestral songs in a piano version in just a moment. It's a setting of a poem by Hugo von Hofmannsthal, which describes the wind of early spring sweeping through the streets of Vienna, bringing thoughts of warmer southern climes as it eddies through quiet apartments in the twilight. You'll hear the rushing of the wind in the right hand of the piano. Look out also for the lovely dancing music that accompanies the words, "Lippen im Lachen hat berührt." Es läuft der Frühlingswind durch kahle Allee. Seltsame Dinge sind in seinem Wehen. Hat sich gewegt, wo Weinen war, und hat sich geschmiegt in zerrüttetes Haar. Es schüttelt nieder Akatienblüten und kühlt die Glieder, die atmend glitten, atmend glitten. Durch die glatten Kanäle treibt sein Wehen, nasse Schatten und den Duft, den gebracht, von wo gekommen seit gestern Nacht, seit gestern Nacht. Lippen im Lachen hat berührt, sie weichen und wachen, Ohren durchspürt, glitt durch die Flatter, schoss in den Schrei und brennende Worte flogen flog im Schweigen durch flüsternde Zimmer und leuchteten We're coming to the end of the story. In 1938, the German army marched into Austria and the Nazis declared the Anschluss, in which Austria was incorporated into the German Third Reich. Many Viennese Jews went into exile, including Schoenberg, Zemlinsky, and Erich Korngold. Well-known artists who were not Jewish were expected to join the Nazi Chamber of Culture. Johanna Müller-Hermann was one of these, though I have found no evidence that she sympathized with the Nazis. Müller-Hermann died suddenly in 1941, leaving her musical archive to her sister, Torna, who had a successful career as a singer and singing teacher. Sadly, many of Müller-Hermann's personal effects were lost when her husband died a few years later. Mathilde Kralik died in 1944. One of her heirs was Dr. Alice Scarlates, who she had lived with for many years, following her mother's death in 1905. Whether her relationship with Alice Scarlates was a lesbian partnership or just a long friendship isn't easy to ascertain. Else Bienenfeld did not leave Vienna after the Anschluss. In November 1938, after a night where synagogues had been bombed and torched all over Vienna, Bienenfeld suffered a breakdown in her mental health. Despite this, in early 1939, she tried to send some belongings and to transfer money to Switzerland under a false name, presumably as a prelude to attempting to escape to Switzerland. She was denounced and arrested for breaking the currency exchange laws. She was sentenced to a 4-month term in prison and a large fine. Because she was unable to pay the fine, her library was confiscated by the Gestapo. Finally, in 1942, she was deported to a death camp in what is now Minsk in Belarus, and she was murdered there on the 26th of June, 1942. Now, for a number of decades, there is silence. My 4 musicians, although remembered by their families, had almost no posthumous fame or memorials. Then, in the 1990s, a Viennese postgraduate music student called Anne-Catherine Adelier came across a photo of Johanna Müller-Hermann. Looking for clues to her life, she looked her up in the Austrian National Library. Not long after, a dusty box was dumped on her desk, Müller-Hermann's archive, untouched since her sister Torna left it to the library on her death decades earlier. Anne-Catherine contacted Müller-Hermann's great-nephew and pieced together Müller-Hermann's life for her master's dissertation. Meanwhile, the Austrian government was attempting to make restitution for goods that were stolen by the Nazis by tracking down descendants of the owners and returning items to them. In 2008, a single book, all that could be identified from Else Bienenfeld's confiscated library, was returned to a member of her family living in London. In 2016, I came across Johanna Müller-Hermann in the Dictionary of Austrian Women Composers by the scholars Eva Marx and Gerlinde Haas. I was responding to a call by the BBC for interesting large-scale music by women composers for Radio 3 to broadcast. On the strength of her string quartet, which had been recorded by the Artist Quartet in 1998, and a small amount of information that I could find out about her life, I proposed Müller-Hermann to the BBC. Over the last decade, they have broadcast a significant proportion of her music. A number of fine singers have taken up her songs, and I have enjoyed introducing audiences to her music in my own recitals, in my teaching, and in interviews when she was Composer of the Week in 2023. As I researched Müller-Hermann's life, I became fascinated by the networks of relationship between all the people who she interacted with in her life and career. I realized that there was a story to be told, not just about one interesting composer, but about a whole ecosystem of artists, male and female, who shaped the musical life of Vienna at this extraordinary time. Here is another diagram which shows links between musicians in Vienna and a range of artists of other kinds, many of whom I haven't had time to tell you about today. Now look what happens if you grey the women out. I think you'll agree that it's time to put the women back in. We'll finish with another song by Johanna Müller-Hermann, an early setting of Goethe's poem, Die Entfernte. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Carola, Marie-Noël. That was absolutely wonderful. For me, that was an extraordinary, insightful, beautifully delivered, and deeply sad and thought-provoking at times lecture recital, exploring the often challenging and sometimes really tragic role of women musicians in Vienna. But it's been really special to not only hear the stories so wonderfully told, but also to hear the songs that they sung and composed so magnificently. So thank you both very much indeed. Next week, we turn to astrophysics and the Song of the Stars by Professor Connie Ahertz. So please join us again then. Thank you very much.